Victory in the war has not brought the hoped-for solution to all the problems in this part of the Middle East. Egypt, for example, declares that she will not reopen the Suez Canal until Israel gives up Arab territory she has conquered, which the Israelis are not prepared to do.
Israel's new Prime Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir, visited troops in the Sinai Desert, not far from the Suez Canal, where the shells continue to fly. He wanted a chance to inspect and talk to the men who were living face to face with the realities of the Middle East situation.
The death of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, after 18 years in power, devastated Egypt and the entire Arab world. His successor, Vice President Anwar Sadat, was considered little more than a caretaker.
Так называемые верные ученики Нассера, они считали, что они обеспечат продолжение курса Нассера, и что Садат будет выполнять волю большинства.
The funeral was a grand family occasion for the leaders of the Arab states and Nasser's Soviet allies. Nasser had severed relations with America, so the representative from Washington expected to be ignored.
Then a soldier came into the room, weaving his way through the crowd. Apparently, it turned out heading for me.
The soldier led the American away, out of sight of the world's press and the watchful eye of the KGB.
Я профессиональным глазом старался наблюдать как можно больше, увидеть все, хотя это было трудно в этом смятении.
We went down the stairs. The lower floor was darkened, and propped up in the hospital bed was the man who had just inherited the presidency of Egypt.
President Sadat was resting behind the scenes after apparently suffering from heat stroke.
He held out his hand to me. It was cold and rather clammy. He said that he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to turn a new page in the relationship between our countries.
The next day, Sadat was sufficiently recovered to organize a photo opportunity for the American media.
The United States provide Israel from the loaf of bread to the phantom to the even deficit in the budget itself. So it is the vein of life. Vein of life for Israel goes from the United States.
Sadat wanted the Americans to help him get back the Sinai Desert, the Egyptian land Israel had seized in the Six-Day War. In the 3 years since the war, Israel had established a formidable defense line along the Suez Canal, close to the heart of Egypt. The canal had been closed since the Six-Day War. Sadat now proposed that if Israel moved back a few miles from the canal, he would reopen it, even to ships trading with Israel. Sadat's proposal was designed to appeal to the minority in the Israeli cabinet, including war hero Moshe Dayan, who believed the Sinai should eventually be returned to Egypt.
What we say is that we sit there just because the war is going on. But once you agree to make peace agreement, we don't think that we should sit on your Suez Canal.
But his prime minister was not an advocate of trading land for peace.
You want the Golan Heights. You want East Jerusalem. You want Gaza Strip. And you want Sinai.
In Washington, President Nixon looked for the right person to urge Sadat's proposal on Golda Meir. He chose Joe Sisko.
I can recall the words to this day. He said, "Joe, press Golda. Press her hard, but don't cause a major Donnybrook between Israel and the United States."
But by the time Joe Sisko arrived in Israel, the Prime Minister had cracked the whip over her cabinet rebels.
Golda Meir took it upon herself to do all of the talking. It was interesting to see everyone here, all the ministers, nobody opening their mouth.
What they did to release their tension was sending little notes to each other.
I sent Dayan a chit saying, "Listen, Moshe, I think we can get you some support." He sent back a very abrupt reply saying sarcastically, "Thank you very much. But if Golda is not for this, then I'm not for it either."
Sisko saw that something was happening, that nobody was supposed to speak there, and so he was a very smart negotiator. He asked the Prime Minister whether he's permitted to ask the Minister of Defense one question, a professional question. So what could she say?
I said to him, "Mr. Minister, if we don't do anything, what do you think is going to happen?"
Dayan said, "Well, I cannot imagine that any government will tolerate indefinitely a situation where a strong army is poised at the gates of its capital." He was exaggerating. After all, our forces were at a distance of more than 100 kilometers from Cairo, and this will lead to war.
The Prime Minister was unmoved. But Joe Sisko kept trying.
The next day, I walked up with these flowers, rather gingerly, and she said to me, "Oh, Joe, now you're saying it with flowers. It won't do you any good."
In Cairo, Israel's rebuff almost brought about the downfall of the man who had proposed the initiative, Anwar Sadat. So he tried a tactic more likely to win Arab support.
داخلين معركة حتمية مهما كانت التضحيات ومهما كانت تكاليف هذه المعركة، ولكن لن نسلم في إرادتنا ولا في سنتي من أرضنا ولا الأرض العربية.
I thought of Sadat as a character out of Aida. I didn't take him seriously. He kept making grandiloquent pronouncements. He never acted on them. So I, frankly, thought he was bluffing.
In fact, Kissinger was too preoccupied with the war in Vietnam to give the Middle East his attention, even when, in another Egyptian zigzag, the first substantial Arab peace offer arrived from Sadat.
He wanted Israel to return to the 67 borders, in return for which Egypt would be willing to make peace, which was a big step because no Arab state had as yet ever flatly said that they would make peace. We were in no position to handle that.
ده كلام السادات بيقول يعني كيسنجر قال لحافظ اسماعيل أنا ما أقدرش أتعامل مع المشكلة بتاعتكم وهي مشكلة ما هياش ساخنة، فلما تبقى المشكلة ساخنة أنا ممكن أتدخل.
Sadat drew the obvious conclusion. If it required a crisis to make Washington intervene, he would have to create one.
اجتمع المجلس الأعلى للقوات المسلحة في منزل الرئيس السادات في الجيزة وقال إن إحنا لا أمل إن يكون في حل سلمي، والحل السلمي يعني معناها استسلام، وأنا غير مستعد إن أنا أعمل استسلام لإسرائيل. الحل البديل لذلك إن إحنا نحارب.
لو احتليتوا 10 سنتي من شرق القناة واحتفظتوا بيهم أنا أستطيع أن أعمل كل ما يمكن أن تتصوروه سياسيا.
President Sadat then proposed a secret alliance with President Assad of Syria. They agreed to organize a joint attack on Israel. Syria's top generals sailed to Alexandria to meet their Egyptian counterparts.
سافرنا على باخرة روسية وبثياب مدنية، وأنا سافرت بجواز سفر مصري مستعار. أخذت اسم جمال حسن.
Once they arrived, they kept up the subterfuge.
بالليل مع بعض سهرانين في المنتزه وقاعدين بيشربوا وبينبسطوا، الناس بتتفرج عليهم وشايفاهم وفاكره ان الضباط السوريين والضباط المصريين في رحله فسحه واخر انبساط وما بيفكروش في الدنيا وما فيها.
Between dips in the hotel pool, the generals discussed the plans for their joint attack and came up with a clever idea for the date.
لأنه ب 6 أكتوبر بيكون بصادف يوم عيد الغفران، عيد كيبورا، وفي هذا الوقت اليهود بيكونوا مرتاحين ما بيساووا أي شيء.
The Syrians' aim was to recapture the Golan Heights, taken from them in the Six-Day War. To keep Israel's troops tied down, they needed Egypt's forces to advance right across the Sinai. But the Egyptians had their own plan, to limit their advance to territory they could protect with their anti-aircraft missiles.
فبتدي مظلة حماية للقوات بتاعتنا اللي شرق القناة 10-12 كيلو، ونستعيد من ضعف القوات الجوية بعملية حرب محدودة.
Egypt's chief of staff urged his president to stick to their own plan.
وبعدين قال ايه؟ طيب نعمل خطة بحيث ان نعرضها على السوريين. فعملنا الخطة بتاعة التقدم إلى المضايق دي فقط لأنها عشان تعرض على السوريين.
وكانت الاتفاق أن يحتل المصريين منطقة المضايق، بيساوي وقف عملياتية 3 أيام، بيعيدوا التنظيم، بعدين بينطلقوا. نحن أيضا نحتل الجولان.
The Syrians fell for it. But it would be harder to fool the enemy. Somehow the Egyptians would have to cross the Suez Canal right under the gaze of Israeli troops.
في مسافة بيني وبين العدو 180-200 متر، شايفه وشايفني. طب أفاجئهم إزاي؟ أفاجئهم في النية أخفيها.
كنا بنقوم بأعمال تدريبية علشان نوع من الخداع للمخابرات الإسرائيلية، تعطي له انطباع أن احنا بنتمرن على الدفاع عن أنفسنا ضد هجوم محتمل من الجانب الإسرائيلي.
The Egyptian and Syrian presidents also set out to deceive their fellow Arab, Jordan's King Hussein. They claimed Israel was about to attack them.
Sadat and Assad were worried about an attack on Syria that could have one of its hooks come through northern Jordan. In the final analysis, I assured them that as far as we were concerned, no one is going to use our country to attack anyone.
King Hussein smelt a rat. The last time Egypt and Syria had maneuvered him into a war with Israel, he had ended up losing a large slice of his kingdom. So he flew off alone, telling no one he was going to meet the enemy, Prime Minister Golda Meir.
I was very concerned and worried that a state of no peace and no war was going to end us up in serious difficulty.
הנושא היחידי שהועלה בפגישה על ידי חוסיין מלך ירדן הייתה התראה על אפשרות של פתיחת מלחמה על ידי סוריה בהצטרפות מצרים.
The Prime Minister received the king alone, but the head of Israeli intelligence, listening to the tape, heard her dismiss the king's warning as the latest in a series of false alarms.
אחת הסיבות שאנחנו לא קיבלנו את הידיעה הזו ב100% אמינות הייתה מתוך כך שגם המלך חוסיין עצמו לא דיבר על 100% ביטחון.
She was pretty formidable, pretty adamant in terms of her position.
The Prime Minister refused to cancel any engagements. Israel took no action.
الهجوم كان يوم السبت 6 أكتوبر، وأنا يوم الجمعة رحت عملت زيارة للجبهة، وقفت على الحافة الغربية للقناة وبصيت لقيت ما فيش أي حاجة توحي بأن العدو حس بالعملية الهجوم بتاعتنا، فكنت مبسوط جدا لدرجة إن أنا بعد ما جيت قلت للرئيس السادات، قلت حتى لو عرفوا دلوقتي ما يهمنيش.
It was not till dawn the next day, as most Jews were preparing to go to synagogue for Yom Kippur, that Israeli intelligence finally became convinced that Egypt and Syria would attack within hours. The Israelis heard the call to arms on the radio and from rabbis in their synagogues. At 2 p.m., as civilians were reporting for duty, Egypt opened fire.
القوات ابتدت تعبر القناة، كانوا بينادي الله أكبر الله أكبر، وهم من الضفة الغربية للضفة الشرقية، كنوع من الإيمان أنهم مصممين على القتال، تحط العلم المصري على سيناء نفسها.
About 6 o'clock, I told my people, my forces, felicitations. The Israelis has lost their balance.
Sadat's armies drove the Israelis from the Suez Canal. Israel's Air Force tried to retaliate, but failed to break through Egypt's missile cover. The Egyptians advanced 12 kilometers into the Sinai and stopped inside their missile cover, as planned. In the north, Syria's attack also caught Israel off balance. 600 Syrian tanks rolled over Israel's defenses and across the Golan Heights.
We weren't ready today. We came from the home, in the middle of Yom Kippur.
So who was here? That was regular soldiers?
Yes, only the regulars.
So they must have had a hard time?
Oh yeah, very hard.
Did you have many casualties?
Well, with such things we don't know. He's not allowed to talk about them.
אנחנו צריכים עכשיו להמשיך וללחום בחירוף נפש, בגבורה ובאמונה, כעם שיודע שנלחם על חייו, ואנחנו נלחמים על חיינו.
Israel's defeat appeared imminent. But on the fourth day, the Syrians ran into large Israeli forces. Israel had been able to divert these troops to the Syrian front because the Egyptian army had halted. Syria's president demanded to know why the Egyptians were not advancing through the Sinai, as agreed.
الرئيس الأسد كان يتكلم مع الرئيس السادات أنه نحن ما لنا متفقين على هذا الشيء، وكان طبعا السادات يقول يراوغ في الإجابة.
Syria appealed over Sadat's head to the superpower that was still Egypt's patron. The Soviet Prime Minister came to Cairo to sort things out.
Премьер-министр Косыгин спрашивал его о том, почему он не продолжает освобождение Синайского полуострова, так успешно начав операцию. Он полностью не удовлетворен разговорами с Садатом.
President Sadat yielded to Soviet pressure and gave the order to advance, much to the dismay of his chief of staff.
محكوم عليها بالفشل قبل تنفيذها، ليس فقط بالنسبة للتفوق الجوي والتفوق وعدم وجود دفاع جوي، ولكن أيضا للنسبة العددية.
Now the battle began to swing Israel's way. In 3 hours, they destroyed 250 Egyptian tanks. But Egypt still had 2 armies in the Sinai. The Israelis planned a daring coup. They set out to cut through the gap in the Egyptian lines, create a bridgehead over the canal, and sweep around to isolate the Egyptian Third Army. The architect of the plan was General Ariel Sharon.
חדירה בין הארמיות התנהלה בשקט וכמעט ללא הפרעה. אבל פעולת ההרחבה של אזור הצליחה הייתה כרוכה בקרב קשה ביותר. בסופו של דבר הצלחנו בסביבות 1 בלילה להעביר את כוחות הצנחנים בסירות גומי לצד השני.
The next day, Israeli forces raced across the canal to secure their stranglehold.
עמדתי ממש על שפת התעלה, ראינו בצד השני את העצים, את הירק ואת הטנקים שהולכים. הייתה בהחלט הרגשה מאוד טובה.
Israel's troops were now only hours from Cairo. President Sadat begged the Soviets to arrange a ceasefire.
The Israelis crossed the canal, and about 24 hours later, we got a message from Brezhnev inviting me to come to Moscow.
Обе стороны считали, что поездка Киссинджера в Москву может помочь снять накал, который существовал в этом конфликте.
We thought it would give the Israelis more time if I went to Moscow, because nothing could happen until I got there. While I was in the air, Nixon sent a message directly to Brezhnev saying that I was fully authorized to conclude, but I frankly wanted to stall.
The Soviets were in such a hurry to end the fighting that General Secretary Brezhnev led the talks with Kissinger himself.
Мы настояли на том, что нужно прекращать наступление. Но Киссинджер соглашался, но в то же время он говорил, конечно, прекращать надо вроде, но надо, чтобы и арабы что-то признали, или существование, или какое-то право их.
I told Brezhnev I would carefully communicate everything he said to Washington, but that there had to be some time interval so that I could get the president's views. And he said, no, here's a message. And he gave me power of attorney, that in effect power of attorney that the president had given me, which did not thrill me.
The Secretary of State realized he could stall no longer. There and then, in Moscow, he agreed terms for a ceasefire. He need not have worried. It was another 5 days before the Israelis halted their advance. A day later, the opposing generals met in the desert to work out how to disentangle their forces. It was the first formal meeting of Egyptian and Israeli officers for 25 years.
وبعدين قال نجيب قهوة، قلت له برضه متشكر مفيش حاجة. طب نجيب أي حاجة تانية أنتوا عاوزينها؟ لا متشكر. وبعدين قال الدنيا برد وأنتم ما عندكوش البلاطي، خدوا بلاطي من عندنا علشان البرد فترة البتاع. قلت له لا متشكر. وخلصت المقابلة الأولى لغاية الفجر.
It was a week before the Egyptian general began to relax.
طلعنا برا والصحراء موجودة كلها رمل، قعدنا على الأرض اللي موجودين وخريطة حطيناها على الأرض وشوية حجارة بقى من كل ناحية نحطها عليها. وبعدين لما اتناقشت معاه في الموضوع بتاع القوات اللي موجودة في الضفة الغربية
אמרתי לו, תראה, צריך קודם כל למנוע את החיכוך. ולכן הדרך הכי טובה הייתה שקודם כל אתם תיסוגו מהגדה המזרחית, תפנו את הגדה המזרחית בשטחים שאתם אורזים, תחזרו אחורה, אנחנו נחזור מתוך מצרים אחורה לקווים הקודמים.
اتفقنا على الطرفين. رحت للرئيس السادات وقلت له انه حصل كذا وكذا وكذا، وطبعا كان مرتاح من نتيجة الناحية الإيجابية من الناحية الثانية.
الله أكبر الله أكبر.
The dead were returned to their own people and supplies allowed through to the trapped Egyptian army. But Sadat wanted more than disengagement. He wanted the Sinai back. So once again, he turned to the Americans.
He came out in military uniforms and said, I need a Kissinger plan. I agreed to do a shuttle and settle it fast, and he said he would make major concessions to make it possible.
The Secretary of State decided the way forward was to bring all parties to a peace conference in Geneva.
I never thought you would kiss a woman.
The Egyptians and Israelis agreed to attend the conference.
I wonder who's kissing her now.
The key now lay with President Assad of Syria.
I had heard he was impossible, but he greeted me with extraordinary politeness and courtesy. And I said, you know, it's amazing. They all accuse you of being so difficult.
فكان كل ما طلب منه كيسنجر تعديل التاريخ يقول له أنا موافق، ويقول له في المكان الفلاني يقول له موافق، يقول له والله كثير على الرئيس متساهل.
I got overconfident and I said, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? He said, yes, you didn't ask me whether I'm going to the conference. I said, are you? He said, no.
Kissinger did have some success. He talked the rival armies back to their pre-war positions. But Sadat had still not got back Egypt's lost land. So he pursued with new vigor the Arab demand for a comprehensive peace.
Israel must move on all the fronts, on the Egyptian front, the Syrian front, the Jordanian front, the Palestinian front.
Sadat embraced the cause that lay at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinians' demand for their own state.
You see, we are cooperating together. And as we have mentioned, there are three partners: Egyptians, Syrians, and the Palestinians.
2 years later, Israel's voters set back Arab hopes. They elected a leader even more determined than his predecessors to hold on to land occupied by Israel.
What occupied territories? If you mean Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, they are liberated territories. They are part, an integral part of the land of Israel.
The new prime minister was godfather to the first Israeli boy born in Hebron on the West Bank. He made the building of settlements the first priority of his government. Settlements like the new town of Yamit, where 5,000 Jews lived in the Sinai. This was not a man Sadat would find it easy to do business with.
Sadat is an implacable enemy of Israel. This is also the truth. He is no fool, but he is an enemy.
Sadat's response would write his name indelibly into the history books. He announced he would make a keynote speech to the Egyptian parliament. He invited the leader of the PLO to attend.
Arafat was happy to be in the parliament, and he was happy that Sadat is paying attention to the Palestinian problem.
السادات بعدين ابتعد عن الورق المكتوب وابتدى يتكلم من دماغه كلام آخر. فأنا قلت لوزير الخارجية إسماعيل فهمي الظاهر هو هيرمي قنبلة دلوقتي وقنبلة سياسية.
7 years of frustration boiled up in Sadat. He had tried everything. Now he broke the final Arab taboo.
إنما تسمعني لأن أقول أمامكم أنني مستعد أن أذهب إلى بيتهم إلى الكنيسة ذات ومناقشتهم.
The idea that Sadat intended to go alone to meet the enemy was too much for most of his audience to take in.
قوبل بتصفيق حاد من جميع أعضاء مجلس الشعب. من ضمن الذين صفقوا للرئيس السادات كان ياسر عرفات لأنه كان قاعد جنبي مباشرة، يعني ما أقدرش أقول إن أنا شفته من بعيد أو أي شيء.
Sadat had put the ball firmly in Israel's court. At first, Prime Minister Begin did not respond.
סאדאת אמר ברעיון שאם בגין ישלח לו הזמנה ויקבל אותה, הוא מוכן לבוא לירושלים כבר בשבוע הבא.
The next day, the Prime Minister was hosting a lunch at the Hilton Hotel.
ראש המשרד של CBS בארץ, הוא רוצה את תגובתו של בגין. הוא היה באמצע אכילת המרק על השולחן הראשי, ואמרתי לו את מה שצריך לומר לו, והוא אומר לי, בסדר, אני אזמין את סאדאת מעל הבמה הזאת.
I invite President Sadat on behalf of the government of Israel to come to Jerusalem and to start negotiations to establish permanent peace between Israel and Egypt.
Before accepting the invitation, Sadat flew to Syria to persuade President Assad that his trip to Jerusalem would not be a betrayal of the Arab cause.
فطلبنا من الرئيس أن يعتقل أنور السادات، تأخذ قرار بالقيادة باعتقاله وعدم سفره إلى مصر.
But the president saw Sadat as his guest and preferred to hear him out first.
الرئيس يحاول أن يثنيه عن عزمه على السفر.
He told me it will be proved that you are wrong. I said, very well, Assad. This is a sacred mission for me. And if this is going to be the last mission as a president, I shall be very happy to fulfill it.
الرئيس حافظ ما انقنع 7 ساعات متواصلة والرئيس يحاول أن يثنيه عن عزمه
Assad's ministers urged him to act. The presidential guard was standing by.
فالرئيس لم يوافق وقال هذا يمس بالأخلاق العربية وبالمناقب العربية أن يعتقد إنسان ضيفه.
President Sadat returned safely to Egypt. 3 days later, he set off for Jerusalem.
كوزير الدفاع بينتابني أفكار كثيرة كلها وحشة، لأنه رايح في جانب العدو اللي لنا ليه 40 سنة أعداء مع بعض، ورايح يقعد وياهم ويبات ليلة عندهم. فدي أنا كنت بفكر فيها أفكار كلها ليست مريحة بالنسبة لي.
והמטוס שלו איחר בכמה דקות. אפילו שמעתי אחד מבכירי אנשי הביטחון הישראלים מביע את הספק, אומר, רגע אחד, אולי פה באמת יש מלכודת. אולי המטוס ינחת בשדה התעופה, ובמקום סאדאת, מהפתח תצא קבוצה של חיילים מתאבדים, ותחסל את כל ההנהגה הישראלית שעומדת על הרציף.
When we arrived in Tel Aviv, it was like I was coming to outer space. It means it was something completely new. I find myself in a car, sitting near Moshe Dayan, and we have to find how to begin a conversation. And I have read in the book that he was interested in archaeology. So I mentioned that I was interested in archaeology, and we begin to talk archaeology.
The Israeli public greeted Sadat's arrival from Egypt as though he were Moses, come again.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
Sadat offered peace, but he was careful not to abandon the other Arab states or the Palestinians.
هناك أرض عربية احتلتها ولا تزال تحتلها إسرائيل بالقوة المسلحة، ونحن نصر على تحقيق الانسحاب الكامل منها بما فيها القدس العربية.
הוא נאם נאום לא פשוט, לא פשוט. עד כדי כך שאני כתבתי פתק לבגין, שצריך להיזהר וצריך להתכונן לכל מיני דברים.
יזהר ויצמן, שהיה מאוד מאוד חסיד של השלום, סיפר לי שכששמע את הנאום, והוא היה שר ביטחון, הוא חשב שצריך לגייס מילואים.
The visitors went from the Knesset to a dinner in their honor.
It was a kind of dinner where there was not much talk. The atmosphere was cool.
الرئيس سادات ومستر بيجن حتى كانوا قاعدين ما تبادلوش كلام، مد كتفه للمستر بيجن. فطبعا على طول انا فكرت اني اقابل إزر وايسمان وإيجاليا دي في السويت بعد العشاء.
Mustafa Khalil told me we have to do something, otherwise the whole trip will be without any follow-up. What about having a meeting together? I say no objection.
פתאום אני יושב עם נציגים של האויב הכי קשה שלנו במלון המלך דוד, שותה איתם black label.
I want to enter directly in the process and mentioning what are the problems of Cairo today and the problems of Egypt, and this is why we need peace.
אמרתי, עכשיו אני רוצה להראות לך משהו. לקחתי אותו לחלון, הסתכלנו על ירושלים, ואמרתי, תסתכל יפה. אתה חושב שאתה יכול לחלק את העיר הזו?
I say the solution is this direct talk with the leadership of Israel, and through this direct talk, direct contact, everything will be solved.
It wasn't that simple. After the trip to Jerusalem, the two sides continued to talk for 7 months.
I'll see you next week or in 2 weeks' time.
But Begin would not give an inch. Sadat confided in the new president of the United States.
Sadat felt that the peace process, instead of having been moved forward, had actually been almost terminated by a fruitless gesture to go to Jerusalem. So he was quite discouraged.
I asked President Carter, the Senate, the Congress, to take their share as full partners in the dispute that's between us and Israel. I'm waiting for this moment.
I found myself isolated from all my advisors. All of them thought that it was a bad idea.
The president decided to undertake Mission Impossible. He set out to resolve 30 years of conflict in a week of talks at the presidential retreat at Camp David.
We arrived by helicopters, and we find this kind of small bungalows in the forest. People quite relaxed. People were using bicycles, and it was quite strange for us.
Some of the Americans even brought their children. The National Security Advisor challenged Israel's Prime Minister to a game of chess and got a foretaste of his negotiating technique.
I was about to make my first move when he dramatically seized my hand in midair and looked me straight in the eye and said, and he's always very serious and formal, Dr. Brzezinski, do you know when I played my last chess game? And quite frankly, I was a little dismayed because I couldn't care less. And he says to me, September 1940, when the NKVD broke into my hiding place in Vilna to arrest me. So I said to myself, oh my God. And in the midst of the game, Mrs. Begin appears. She looks at us and says, oh, the two of you are playing chess. You know, Mr. Brzezinski, Menachem just loves to play. He just loves to play. He plays all the time.
When President Carter brought the two leaders together, Sadat listed the demands his allies and advisers wanted. Not only the return of all the Sinai to Egypt, but also a Palestinian state based in the West Bank with its capital in Old Jerusalem.
Sadat and I both knew that this was not going to be at all acceptable to me or the Israelis.
כולנו קפצנו בתקרה, זה לא רק בגין. כן, זה היה נהיה קשה מאוד. שוב אני אגיד לך שאני לא זוכר בדיוק, רק כולנו כעסנו וכולנו אמר, חבר'ה, זה לא ילך ככה.
They wanted to storm out, to terminate the talks. And I jumped up from the desk where I was sitting and writing and got in the door in front of them. And I wouldn't let them get out of the room until they both agreed to let me try to continue. And after that, the two men never saw each other for the next 10 days.
The incompatibilities between the two sides were so intense that some sort of an American document bridging the gap and extracting from each side those relatively few elements on the part of each side that were of a compromise nature seemed to us to be the only way to proceed.
So I carried the same text back and forth. Begin and Sadat agreed to go with the same text, with brackets and modifications and marginal notes.
Carter's shuttle focused their attention on a clause that would require Israel to give up Gaza and the West Bank to the Palestinians.
Begin simply dug in his heels and says this is totally unacceptable.
As far as he was concerned, this was Greater Israel, or it's Israel, and they hadn't acquired territory by force. It had always been ordained as part of Israel.
Begin remained intransigent. So Carter persuaded Sadat to give up his demand for a Palestinian state, to the outrage of his advisers.
It was a real shock for us. Our main preoccupation was to avoid a bilateral agreement between Israel and Egypt at the expense of the Palestinians.
But that wasn't enough for the Israelis. They dug in their heels on the Sinai, too.
They say, no, they are refusing to withdraw from the Sinai, that they want to maintain the 3 airports, that they want to maintain the settlements.
The Israelis delegated Moshe Dayan to convince Sadat that he would have to compromise on the Sinai, too.
Dayan told him, Mr. President, if anybody has told you that Israel can leave the Sinai settlements, they are deluding you. President Sadat was so upset that he asked me for airplanes. He said, I'm leaving. If I cannot even get Sinai back, then what is the use of my continuing this peace process?
I asked Sadat if he would go back in his cabin and talk to me. All of his bags were on the front porch. I told Sadat he had betrayed our friendship. He had violated a commitment that he made to me, that he would give me full opportunity to resolve any differences that arose, and that I thought that his peremptory action in leaving without giving me another chance would also seriously and adversely affect the relationships between our two countries.
Sadat unpacked his bags. Carter would have to get the Israeli Prime Minister to yield.
I was about to play tennis. I was dressed in whites. Begin was always dressed as if he was about to go to a funeral. And we went for a walk in the Camp David woods. And he says to me very dramatically, I want you to understand that my right eye will fall out. My right hand will fall off before I ever sign a single scrap of paper permitting the dismantling of a single Jewish settlement.
Prime Minister Begin had taken a solemn oath before God and the Israeli people that he would not dismantle Israeli settlements. So I had to devise an alternative to that so that he would not do it.
Carter urged Begin's advisers to find a way round their Prime Minister's solemn oath.
The only way was to let the Knesset make the decision and not him.
Dayan and Weitzman started speaking up to Begin in Hebrew rather than in English as they did in the past.
ואמרתי לו, תראה, לא ייתכן שנחזור מכאן עם ידיים ריקות. אתם מוכרחים ואנחנו נשתדל בכל אופן למצוא איזושהי דרך ביניים.
Begin's colleagues concluded that the only way to persuade him that dismantling the settlements would not damage him politically was to get the settlers' champion on the phone.
ראש הממשלה מנחם בגין זיכרונו לברכה אמר לי שיש קשיים במשא ומתן בנושא היישובים היהודיים בסיני. איך אני רואה את הדבר? אני עניתי לו במשפט אחד, אני אתמוך בכל החלטה שתקבל.
Prime Minister Begin's phone call opened the way for a White House ceremony. The Knesset voted to dismantle the Sinai settlements. Egypt became the first Arab state to recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel gave back the Sinai.
Let's have a handshake before we move.
Sadat and Begin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
I'm so proud of both of you. God bless you both.
While we have the ceremony and the different speeches and the different signature, we were listening to the Palestinians, which were outside, and was just shouting to remind us that the Palestinian problem have not been solved.
The peace with Israel that Sadat concluded has lasted to this day. But the Arab peoples and their leaders did not forgive Sadat. 2 years later, at a military display in Cairo, Islamic extremists assassinated Anwar Sadat.
The 50 Years' War, Noah Percy's acclaimed 1998 documentary, continues next on BBC4.